Well, thank you all for joining us tonight. Congregation Va-Dor offers the touch of Jewish history tonight. I'm Sharon Leibovitz, and I welcome all of you to hear the story and career of Louis D. Brandeis. Thank you for being with us, and we're going to get right into talking a little bit about Louis. Louis David Brandeis was born on November 13th, 1856 in Louisville, Kentucky. He was the youngest of four children. His parents, Adolf Brandeis and Frederica Dembitz, immigrated to the United States from their childhood homes in Prague, now in Czech Republic. Known as the People's Attorney, Louis D. Brandeis gained a reputation as a formidable defender and advocate for everyday Americans through his many crusading cases, which included exposing corruption, fighting railroad trusts, and defending laws restricting women's working hours. Many of his clients received his services for free since he felt that the public would benefit. Louis Brandeis is considered the founder of the modern pro bono tradition in the United States. He dedicated half his time to public causes, fighting monopolies, and defending workers. President Woodrow Wilson appointed Louis, then age 59, to the United States Supreme Court to considerable controversy, supposedly over his perceived anti-business stance, but most likely due to his Jewish ancestry, being the first Jew to be appointed to the High Court. However, progressives slowly convinced Democrats of his suitability, and Brandeis was sworn to the court in June of 1916. As one newspaper in his native Kentucky wrote, Brandeis has the temperament of the crusader rather than of the judge. We are not worried over that. A little adaptability is only a sideline with a man of Louis Brandeis's brilliant mentality and boundless capacity. As far as the religious beliefs of Louis Brandeis, although his family was Jewish, only his extended family practiced a more conservative form of Judaism. They celebrated the main Christian holidays along with most of their Louisville, Kentucky community, treating Christmas as a secular holiday. His parents raised their children to be high-minded idealists rather than depending solely on religion for their purpose and inspiration. In later years, his mother, Frederica, wrote of this period, I believe that only goodness and truth and conduct that is humane and self-sacrificing towards those who need us can bring God nearer to us. I wanted to give my children the purest spirit and the highest ideals as to morals and love. God has blessed my endeavors. According to biographer Melvin Orofsky, Louis Brandeis was influenced greatly by his uncle, Louis Naphtali Dembitz. Unlike other members of the extended Brandeis family, Dembitz regularly practiced Judaism and was actively involved in Zionist activities. Louis Brandeis later changed his middle name from David to Dembitz in honor of his uncle, and through his uncle's model of social activism, became an active member of the Zionist movement later in his life. Louis grew up in a family enamored with books, music, and politics, perhaps best typified by his revered uncle Louis Dembitz, a refined, educated man who served as a delegate to the Republican convention in 1860 that nominated Abraham Lincoln for president. Louis married at the age of 34 his second cousin, Alice Goldmark of New York, since he had little time for courtship. They had two daughters, Susan in 1893 and Elizabeth in 1896. Louis served on the Supreme Court from 1916 to February 1939 when he retired due to failing health. He died in October 5th, 1941 at the age of 84. I would normally go right into our videos, but I thought it would behoove me to give you some of the definitions that you might hear during some of the videos. The first is the word opinion. A Supreme Court justice's opinion is a formal written document explaining the legal reasoning, rationale, and judgment behind the court's decision in a case. These opinions, which set binding legal precedent, establish the rule of law for future disputes. Key types include majority, concurring, and dissenting opinions. A majority opinion represents the official decision of the court, requiring agreement from more than half of the justices, at least 5 out of 9. A concurring opinion is written by a justice who agrees with the final decision but disagrees with the legal reasoning of the majority. A dissenting opinion, or a dissent, is a Supreme Court dissenting opinion is a formal written statement by one or more justices disagreeing with the majority decision in a case and outlining their alternative legal interpretations. While it holds no binding legal authority or precedent, a dissent explains the legal reasoning for the disagreement, often aimed at influencing future legal interpretations or urging legislative action. Dissents serve to voice objectives to the majority's reasoning, highlight potential errors, and provide a voice for future legal arguments. Opinions are crucial for communicating rulings to lower courts, lawyers, and to the public. Louis Brandeis wrote 454 opinions and 74 dissents during his almost 23-year tenure as a Supreme Court justice. And with that, I will move on to showing the videos. Thank you so much for being with us. This first video we have is a quick summary of his life. Enjoy.
On the 1st of June 1916, Louis Brandeis became the first Jewish justice on the Supreme Court of the United States of America. Louis Brandeis was born to Jewish parents who had moved to the United States from Prague in the aftermath of the European revolutions of 1848. He grew up in Kentucky and graduated from Harvard Law School with the highest grades ever achieved up to that point when he was 20 years old. Brandeis soon established himself as a talented barrister and set up a law firm in Boston with Samuel Warren, a friend from his time at Harvard. The success of the firm provided him with the financial security to take on an increasing number of progressive cases that championed social justice, and for which he took no payment since he deemed them to be of public interest. This led to Brandeis earning the moniker the People's Lawyer, as he challenged the power of big business, fought to expose public corruption, and oppose the monopolistic behaviour of oligarchs. On the 28th of January 1916, President Woodrow Wilson nominated Brandeis to the Supreme Court, but he faced bitter opposition from business owners and other members of the social and economic elite who viewed him as a radical, alongside broader anti-Semitic attitudes. As a result, it took 125 days for him to be finally confirmed on the 1st of June by a vote of 47 to 22. As a Supreme Court justice, Brandeis wrote opinions in favour of individual liberty and freedom of speech while protecting citizens' rights to privacy. When he eventually retired from the Supreme Court in February 1939, the New York Times, which had led criticism of his nomination in 1916, referred to him as one of the great judges of our time.
This next video is about life in Louisville, Kentucky, with Louis Brandeis.
First things first, we're not being familiar when we call him Louis and not Louis, even though he was named after his uncle Louis.
His uncle was Louis Dembitz. His uncle spelled his name Lewis, and he was, I think, actually named for his uncle kind of indirectly, but his name is pronounced Louis. It's Louis Brandeis, not Louis Brandeis.
Louis Brandeis was the son of Adolph Brandeis, a Louisville merchant.
Well, he was born in 1856, and his first memories, given the time, were his mother serving food and coffee to Union soldiers on his front yard. And I always think he was so committed to service, and that his first memories were someone serving someone else. I think that really made an imprint on him.
Louisville's imprint on Brandeis was lifelong, even though he never lived in the city again after leaving for Harvard Law School. Brandeis's grandson, Frank Gilbert, in town for the U of L Brandeis Medal presentation, confirms his grandfather's lasting connection to the city and university.
Grandfather retained a tremendous interest in the city. His brother was here. Various members of the family were here. So he took a real interest in the developments here, and he felt very strongly that the University of Louisville could make a real contribution to the city and, if you will, the entire Commonwealth of Kentucky. So he felt very deeply about Louisville.
But that's typical Louisville. It's that the people who have a connection to Louisville never are able to rid themselves of that connection and are constantly reaffirming their connection to this city. And I think with Brandeis, it had a lot to do with the whole spirit of this community, that it was all-inclusive, that it's a great tradition of fairness and tolerance and justice.
He was a big believer in the local community, and I think because his family remained here, he was very connected, and he did visit frequently. It was his wish that we have his personal papers, so these are letters between family members. We've had several scholars, Mel Urofsky, David Levy, Philippa Strum, and others who have come and used the papers, written about them. He had very specific ideas about the different library collections that we should have here, and so he would donate money and send it to, and his brother was kind of his agent for making sure it was spent on the right kinds of library collections and so on. He was maybe a bit of a micromanager, but I think it turned out to be a good thing. And in fact, when he donated his papers to our law school, he recognized that it was going to take some time and effort to catalog them and archive them and so on. So he also donated money to make sure that happened. So he was very practical. The fact that he wanted our law school to have them means a lot, and he chose to be buried here. He's buried at the portico of our law school.
Around finals, the justice's grave marker, as well as his wife's, are confettied with tokens from students, coins for good luck, and animal crackers, a Brandeis favorite.
And it was told to me that sometimes with the animal crackers, the box is there. The next morning, the box is there, but the crackers are gone because the squirrels have taken them.
Recently, students from Brandeis Elementary, named for another Brandeis relative, set a wreath at the grave. The ceremony was attended by this year's Brandeis Medal winner, former Justice John Paul Stevens. His reaction to the scene was not unlike what Laura Rothstein would imagine Justice Brandeis's to be.
He would have really appreciated those young children sort of knowing the history and knowing the connection and knowing what he stood for.
A mosaic at the law school highlights one thing Brandeis stood for: the link among knowledge, understanding, and judgment. Another Brandeis standard helped frame a change in U of L's law school requirements.
We adopted a public service requirement several years ago, and we're one of the few law schools in the country that has a mandatory public service. Our students have to do 30 hours of public service work, and that came from his model of donating his time to public causes. He would also pay his law firm for the time he wasn't working for them.
Whether it be a bust or bobblehead, the Brandeis image is everywhere on campus. Downtown, you can find it stories high on West Jefferson Street. Laura Rothstein, who was once dean of the law school and authored the book Brandeis at 150, notes the justice's continuing importance as a groundbreaking Jewish member of the court, as someone regularly named among the top jurists ever, and as a man whose loyalty to Louisville outlived him. And were he around right now? Laura says he'd continue his dedication to just causes, and though you might see him on foot, you wouldn't see him online.
He was not a fan of technology. He didn't like using the telephone. He rode a horse and buggy to the court long after there were automobiles. So I don't think he would not use a telephone today, but I don't think I could imagine him being on Facebook.
This next video is 10 minutes, and it's probably the most important one that you're going to see tonight about Louis Brandeis. Standing for the people.
As a lawyer, he practiced with integrity. As a reformer, he stood for the common man. As a Zionist, he ignited a revolution that would affect millions. And as a judge, he practiced what he preached. In a single lifetime, Louis Brandeis took a stand on thousands of issues across 4 careers, always benefiting the working man and forever changing American jurisprudence. Louis D. Brandeis, standing for the people. Louis Brandeis was born on November 13, 1856 in Louisville, Kentucky. His parents were German Jewish immigrants who valued education and culture. At the age of 20, Brandeis graduated with record-setting grades from Harvard Law School. Shortly after, he opened a law firm in Boston with classmate Samuel Warren. In his ensuing 36 years as a lawyer, Brandeis held true to several basic principles. He only accepted cases he believed in. He made sure he knew the facts of a case, and he put his client's monetary interests before his own. By doing this, Brandeis consistently stood for his beliefs, his client's beliefs, and worked to find a square deal for everyone involved.
He had the potential to have a very comfortable life, representing some of the most powerful and wealthy people and corporations in America. And at some point early on, he decided not just to take any case, but he would take cases that he believed were right, and that he would never compromise his principles just to win for a client.
It was in this manner that he came to be known as the best lawyer in Boston, and as one banker wrote, "There is a man who will give you $1's worth for every dollar paid. He'll give you straight advice, and he generally wins." In 1891, Brandeis married his second cousin Alice Goldmark. After marriage, Brandeis decided that he wanted to give back to the society that made him so successful, so he assigned the bulk of the paid law work to the associates at his firm and began dedicating an increasing amount of his time to public service. This paradigm launched Brandeis into participation in dozens of major reforms throughout the 1890s and 1900s. Brandeis always fought on behalf of the working man, stood against bigness in government and business, and advocated for individual liberty and privacy. Brandeis often faced stiff opposition from rich and powerful companies and organizations, and found himself an outcast from Boston's elite circles. Despite this, he continued to stay true to his beliefs. He was a natural leader, and his colleagues had a great deal of respect for him, as he presided with fairness and always listened to both sides of an argument before passing judgment. In these social, economic, and political reforms, the actions of Brandeis and his fellow reformers often resulted in change for the benefit of the working man. These reforms included spoiling a corruption plot to save the Boston subway, incorporating labor unions, which neutralized the weapons of unfair unions but also allowed unions to keep employers in check, dramatically decreasing the price of gas by breaking up Boston Consolidated Gas Company, providing 15 million people with affordable life insurance by igniting an insurance reform with the foundation of Savings Bank Life Insurance, conserving resources in Alaska, and when in the face of several major garment strikes, Brandeis negotiated higher wages and improved working conditions while also giving the owners labor stability. Brandeis's contribution to workers of the time, as well as to the legal practice forever, is exemplified in Mueller v. Oregon, where Brandeis wrote a brief supporting restricted working hours for women. In preparing this brief, Brandeis used an unprecedented technique. Rather than legal arguments, Brandeis focused on social science and economics to detail how long hours adversely affected women. Brandeis won the case, and this brief was coined the Brandeis Brief. Brandeis would write several other briefs in this manner, including Stetler v. O'Hara, which detailed why Oregon ought to enforce a minimum wage. He won this case and continued to fight for a minimum wage, until a federal minimum wage was finally enacted in 1938, enabling workers everywhere to better provide for themselves and their families. The format of these briefs would eventually revolutionize the way law was practiced. For example, Thurgood Marshall's brief in Brown v. Board of Education was a Brandeis brief, focusing on facts to explain how segregated schools adversely affected black children. Although it is common knowledge that the case to desegregate schools was won, it is often lost to the annals of history that this probably wouldn't have been possible without Brandeis's contributions to the legal practice. The reform work that Brandeis did in these years would be the start of pro bono work, or work that a lawyer does for free to help those with limited means of affording an attorney. The idea of pro bono work is brand new. Brandeis practically invents it.
He observed the importance of service as part of the social contract of living in the world, and that became a model for the legal profession. Our law school has adopted that as an important principle, and our students do 30 hours of public service before they graduate.
In 1910, Brandeis was approached by Jacob de Haas, who introduced him to the Zionist movement. Brandeis soon realized that Zionism represented his ideals, and starting in 1911, Brandeis undertook a major leadership role, traveling the country to persuade Jews to join the movement. By 1916, he had transformed the American Zionist movement from a moribund organization into a powerful political presence.
He gave the Zionist cause a legitimacy that it did not have previously, because here was a well-known public figure in the United States who was not a religious zealot. In fact, he was not religious at all. He was Jewish, but he was not a practicing Jew. From a public relations perspective, as I say, I think he gave it a credibility and legitimacy that it did not have before.
Throughout his life, Brandeis made several other important contributions to Zionism, including attending conferences in Europe and working closely with President Roosevelt throughout the 1930s towards getting the British to give the Jews Palestinian land. The movement that Brandeis revolutionized in America would help lead to the creation of Israel. In 1916, Brandeis was nominated to the Supreme Court by Woodrow Wilson. Brandeis accepted the nomination, believing that the best way for him to help the common man was by serving on the court. His nomination was opposed by many, including those who believed he was a radical and those who were simply anti-Semitic. After 4 months of contentious arguments, Brandeis finally became the first Jew accepted to the United States Supreme Court. Throughout his time on the court, Brandeis wrote 454 opinions. Each had a classic Brandeisian twist, and all were written in an effort to make life better for the common man. Many of these opinions had a profound effect on American jurisprudence, including New State Ice Company versus Liebman, in which Brandeis famously coined the term states as laboratories of democracy, as well as Whitney versus California, where Brandeis took a strong stand for free speech, and in doing so put together the basis of modern First Amendment statute. Another extremely important opinion came when Brandeis reinvented Fourth Amendment jurisprudence with his dissent in Olmstead versus United States. In this opinion, along with the article entitled The Right to Privacy, written with Sam Warren in 1890, Brandeis took a strong stand for the right to privacy. The ideas Brandeis pioneered in these writings have been used in many important cases, including Roe versus Wade, which gave women the right to have an abortion, and Obergefell versus Hodges, which guaranteed same-sex couples the right to marry.
The Olmstead decision that wrote later on the court about wiretapping and privacy was also significant because it recognized that people should have an expectation of privacy. The word privacy is not in the Constitution, and it has yet become a constitutional right, primarily because of Brandeis.
At the beginning of President Wilson's first term, Brandeis wrote a series of essays called Other People's Money. In these essays, Brandeis objected to the power that bankers held, including J.P. Morgan, who controlled more than 40% of American capital. He described the way that these bankers handled other people's money as financial recklessness, and in these essays, Brandeis predicted the stock market crash of 1929. As Norman Hapgood wrote, the fatalities following 1929 came to a large extent from failure to act on the principles sharply drawn in Other People's Money. Eventually, President Roosevelt used some of the policies that Brandeis outlined in his book as stepping stones to lift the country out of the Great Depression. The financial reforms of the 1930s that Brandeis inspired helped to ensure financial stability for the next half a century, which was marked by the lowest bank failure rate in American history. This stability would only falter once Brandeis's policy, the Glass-Steagall Act, was dismantled in 1999, leading to the financial crash of 2008. Under Obama's administration, there was even discussion in Congress about reinstating the Glass-Steagall Act to help resolve the recession. Louis Brandeis's life is a perfect case study of what it means to take a stand. Throughout his life, one can find a seamlessness between what he believed and what he did, always fighting for the working man and always upholding his moral standards. As a lawyer, he used facts and integrity to gain the respect of the profession. As a reformer, he made life better for the working man, fighting in nearly every major reform of the progressive era and revolutionizing legal tactics that are still popular today. His participation in the Zionist movement may have been crucial to the foundation of Israel, and perhaps most importantly, Brandeis stood for individual rights and freedoms, outlining ideas and his opinions that are still used by justices from Scalia to Ginsburg.
The man's entire professional life consisted of taking a stand. I think a lot of people will have a moment in their lives when they take a stand, and that can be really impressive. But that's what this man's entire life was about.
This next one asks the question, what did Justice Brandeis mean by his famous vision of states as laboratories of democracy?
It's so hard in America circa 2023 to find principles of constitutional law on which we all agree. And I have to say, this one has stood the test of time. Justice Brandeis at the time was a progressive, but I don't think people think of this idea through the lens of progressivism. I think they think of this through the lens of American federalism. And the point Brandeis was making on a difficult time in American history, the Depression, was when you get new challenges, it's rare at the outset for governments to know exactly the right response. I mean, if we think of it in modern times, I mean, the challenges of opioids, data privacy, technology issues, of course, the pandemic, these are problems that just don't have one answer. And Brandeis is making this very helpful point that we should think of our size, the size of America geographically, and our variation, our different cultures, the Mountain West, the Midwest, the South, the coast, as advantages as opposed to disadvantages when it comes to putting together the best form of government. And I really embrace the Brandeis point. Brandeis didn't assume every experiment would end with one solution. Quite often, 3 or 4 valuable insights emerge, and there's no one of them that really ought to control for the whole country. In fact, it might be quite dangerous to have a control for the whole country. So a corollary of Brandeis's insight is sometimes variation is appropriate because variation is due. Think of gun regulation. I doubt there's a single American that thinks the same sort of rules for gun regulation ought to apply to New York City as they apply in Wyoming. There has to be some room, and I think the U.S. Supreme Court's Heller and Bruin decisions still leave plenty of room for different rules in Wyoming than exist in New York City. So you see this in a lot of areas. There's just nothing wrong with having different sets of rules. Now, sometimes we might have a national baseline, fair enough, established by Congress or established by the U.S. Supreme Court, but that baseline can still leave for plenty of room for experimentation above it. That seems to me quite healthy. If I ask myself one reason for polarization now, it might be that we sometimes have I guess it's an American instinct to be a little impatient. We really care about something. We want it to be the rule for the whole country. And I appreciate the point. I'm as impatient as anybody. But it's sometimes best for all to allow various approaches, be patient about letting one winning insight rise to the top. And if it does, great, let's nationalize it. But otherwise, let the trial and error continue to unfold, hopefully with few errors and lots of benefits.
This next one asks, can you be an American that's a patriot and a Zionist?
If America and Israel ever went to war, whose side would you be on? That's a question that's been batted around by American Jewish children for decades. And while it's often posed in a playful tone, it speaks to a real question at the heart of the American Jewish experience. Is it possible to be a great American and a great Zionist at the same time? Or does an American support for Israel automatically trigger an issue of dual loyalty? Well, that's a question that America's super lawyer, Louis Brandeis, faced in 1914. He really wanted to get appointed to the Supreme Court, and he had the credentials. He was a crusading progressive known as the People's Lawyer, famous for graduating Harvard Law School with the highest GPA in its history, and was close friends with the new president of the United States, Woodrow Wilson. But as a Jew, Louis was being asked to lead the American Zionist movement, which was trying to establish a Jewish homeland in the faraway land of Israel, then known as Palestine. Would such a position doom his political career? Would people doubt his loyalty to America? After all, the US at that time was much less tolerant of Jews than America is today, and most Jews believed that to get ahead, it was best to be an American publicly while keeping your Jewish identity private. Louis decided he didn't care. He would follow his conscience. Besides, he saw no contradiction. He insisted that being a proud Jew made him a better American, just as his Zionism reinforced his liberalism and his Americanism. But Louis wasn't always a Zionist, let alone a proud Jew. Louis was born in Louisville, Kentucky in 1856, the son of immigrants from German-speaking Bohemia. He grew up in a very assimilated household, learning much more about his German cultural roots than his Jewish background. He often had a Christmas tree in the house. Raised as an Abraham Lincoln-loving abolitionist, he made his way to Harvard Law School, graduating first in his class at the ripe old age of 20. Over the next few decades, he built his fame and fortune as a progressive lawyer. Progressives at the time saw society as a laboratory, tinkering constantly with America's most pressing social and economic problems. They believed if you could make just the right changes, you could get just the right results. As a leading reformer, Brandeis was often on the front lines fighting against poverty and injustice, while championing equality and workers' rights. In 1910, when he was 54 years old, Louis was called in as the mediator trying to end the New York garment workers' strike. Watching the mostly Jewish workers struggle with their mostly Jewish bosses changed his life. Louis was impressed that both sides actually listened to one another and bothered understanding the other side's arguments. And hearing the Jewish workers describe their struggle as part of a broader liberal fight for workers' rights, he was impressed that their Jewish heritage opened their eyes and their hearts to others, rather than shutting them down. Around this time, Louis heard about another prominent assimilated Jew, Theodor Herzl, who had his own Jewish wake-up call. Theodor Herzl lived in Europe, and in the 1890s responded to growing anti-Semitism and assimilation by calling for a Jewish state. Louis was fascinated by Herzl's conclusion that the Jews needed to return to their own land, just like all other peoples who at the time were rediscovering their roots and expressing themselves collectively and nationally. Surprisingly, Louis Brandeis found resonance with the Zionist movement, the movement to solve the Jewish problem by freeing the poor, oppressed Jews of the world to live in their own homeland, the land of Israel. The great quality of the Jews is that they have been able to dream through all the long and dreary centuries, Louis realized. At last, Zionism, meaning Jewish nationalism, would give the Jews the power to realize their dreams by establishing a Jewish homeland in the region known at the time as British Palestine. Now, Brandeis had no interest in moving to the land of Israel. American Jews had their own promised land and didn't need a refuge. But Louis and many other American Jews saw no contradiction between being proud Americans and vocal proponents for the Jewish state. American Zionists felt a strong sense of responsibility to create a refuge for fellow Jews suffering around the world, including Poland, Russia, and in Palestine. But it wasn't that easy. Brandeis' close friend and soon-to-be President Woodrow Wilson not only didn't get Zionism, but couldn't understand why any immigrant wouldn't want to become 100% American. Wilson believed that a man who thinks of himself as belonging to a particular national group in America has not yet become an American. In addition, 300 leading American Reform rabbis, fearing they might be seen as disloyal Americans, would lobby Wilson not to support a Jewish national home. But Brandeis defied such pressures, and his conversion was just in time, historically. The outbreak of World War I threatened millions of Jews caught in this great clash. The Zionist movement, based in Berlin, now looked to its American branch to take the lead. And that is why, even as he dreamed of a Supreme Court spot or maybe a prized cabinet job, Louis D. Brandeis found himself in the unlikely position of debating whether or not to head the Federation of American Zionists in 1914. As he thought through the request, Louis also had to rethink his understanding of Americanism, Judaism, and Zionism. To him, the choice was clear. He understood that those eternal blue and white Zionist dreams that kept Jews going for centuries were also red, white, and blue dreams of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, be it as proud American Jewish citizens helping their brothers and sisters around the world, or as proud pioneers in the land of Israel, rebuilding the Jewish homeland. Let no American imagine that Zionism is inconsistent with patriotism, Brandeis insisted. You are a better citizen and a better person if you take care of your own people as well as your country, he taught. And like all other immigrants, only by being stronger, prouder, freer individually and in their community could Jews contribute all that Jewish civilization taught to the great American experiment. It really was a two-way street. The American Zionist movement became the great training ground for American Jews. As they became more involved with Zionism, once passive, cautious American Jews learned how to do politics, advocating for themselves more effectively as Jews and as Americans. Understanding that everyone juggles all kinds of loyalties, Brandeis explained his expansive, generous philosophy. Every Irish American who contributed towards advancing home rule was a better man and a better American for the sacrifice he made. Every American Jew who aids in advancing the Jewish settlement in Palestine, though he feels that neither he nor his descendants will ever live there, will likewise be a better man and a better American for doing so. Under Brandeis and under pressure as the war worsened, the American Zionist movement grew, increasing its membership 20-fold in 5 years. American Zionists were raising millions, and more Americans, both Jews and non-Jews, saw Zionism as the best way for helping oppressed Jews around the world, while mobilizing and inspiring Jews wherever they lived, whatever their circumstances. Even President Wilson turned around, relying on his friend Brandeis to be America's emissary to this rapidly expanding movement. Louis Brandeis's Jewish pride reinforced his American pride. While still leading his people, he was nominated to the United States Supreme Court, becoming the first Jewish Supreme Court justice, and sitting on the court from 1916 to 1939. Years later, President Franklin D. Roosevelt would nickname Louis Isaiah, treating Justice Brandeis as a modern-day prophet. Today, Louis Brandeis is probably the only person in history who has both a major American university named after him, as well as a still thriving kibbutz in northern Israel. Those two institutions reflect the all-American and deeply Jewish message his life conveys. We live today in an either-or world, with people constantly feeling bullied into choosing one extreme or another. Justice Louis Brandeis taught that more is more. By adding commitments, juggling ties, navigating sometimes conflicting feelings, he traded the easy path for the necessary one, and his legacy encourages future generations to do the same.
This next one is from the National Museum of American Jewish History, and speaking about Louis Brandeis is Ruth Bader Ginsburg.
In 1916, with tensions escalating between big industry and labor, President Woodrow Wilson made a bold nomination to the United States Supreme Court. He chose Jewish lawyer and Zionist leader Louis Brandeis, a legendary champion of social justice and workers' rights.
Brandeis believed in economic and social regulation for the people who were not in the seats of power. He was an arch enemy of big business.
Despite fierce anti-Jewish sentiment and opposition from leaders of industry, Brandeis was confirmed as the first Jewish Supreme Court justice. But he would meet continued resistance, even from his new colleagues.
Justice McReynolds was an out-and-out anti-Semite. When Brandeis would speak at court conferences, McReynolds would leave the room.
Driven by his commitment to protect the rights of all citizens, Brandeis went on to write landmark decisions defending free speech and the right to privacy. In the decade since his death in 1941, the Supreme Court has adopted every one of his major dissents as the correct constitutional interpretation.
I think that he was the greatest constitutional jurist of the 20th century. He makes me ever hopeful when I'm writing a dissenting opinion that someday it will be the law of the land. Most of the things worth doing in the world had been declared impossible before they were done. Justice Louis Dembitz Brandeis.
This next one is the author of his biography, Melvin Orofsky.
Last fall, I published a book on dissent and what I called the constitutional dialogue, the give and take between the majority and dissenting opinions. Brandeis, of course, led me to undertake that project, and in my biased eyes, he will always be the great dissenter. In terms of dissenting, over the course of his tenure, Brandeis wrote 454 opinions for the court and only 74 dissents, an average of a little more than 3 dissents a term. But oh, what dissents they are. In a minute, we will look at 2 areas where Brandeis' dissents determine the future course of constitutional jurisprudence. When speaking for the court, Brandeis, like all justices, had to tailor his opinions to reflect the views of the majority. Here, his work as an attorney played an important role. He had the ability, the skill, to marshal the facts and set out an interpretation of the law, sometimes a new interpretation, that commanded a majority. When writing a dissent, however, he felt no such compunction, and in those 74 dissents, we find all of Brandeis' distinguishing characteristics: attention to the context in which a law had been passed, the factual situation that the legislature had relied on, the necessity for the judiciary to defer to the legislative branch in policymaking, the attention to individual liberties, and especially the role that speech played in a democratic society.
This last one is the president of Brandeis University and his legacy.
Hello, I'm Ron Leibowitz, the 9th president of Brandeis University. I'm proud to be part of this extraordinary university, and I'm especially proud to call myself a Brandesian because this word represents so much of what our community embodies. Back in 1948, when our university was founded by members of the American Jewish community, the founders decided that the institution should be named after Louis D. Brandeis, the United States' first Jewish Supreme Court Justice. Born in Louisville, Kentucky to Jewish immigrant parents, Louis Brandeis began his legal career in Boston, where he was known as the People's Attorney for his deep commitment to creating positive change for the average American. Later, he left his mark on the U.S. Supreme Court by supporting the rights of workers, the protection of privacy and religious beliefs, and free speech. Brandeis' novel approach to jurisprudence, using fact-based evidence to argue cases alongside existing legal theory, was transformational for the American justice system and has become foundational to American constitutional law. Many of Justice Brandeis' famous quotes call for us to challenge ourselves, to be seekers, doers, and innovators not afraid of failure as we pursue truth through facts. They call for us to be courageous in pursuit, ultimately, of a better world. Being a Brandeisian comes with the great responsibility of living up to the ideals of our namesake. Doing so is no small task. At the time of our university's founding, world-renowned scientist and Brandeis backer Albert Einstein recognized this immense responsibility, writing, "Brandeis is a name that cannot be merely adopted, it is one that must be achieved." Since then, our university has accepted Einstein's challenge and done great things in a short amount of time. We are a major research institution and a top-tier liberal arts university. We were granted a Phi Beta Kappa chapter after only 13 years, and we became a member of the Association of American Universities, North America's leading group of research universities, faster than any other school. But perhaps even more impressive, Brandeisian after Brandeisian who has passed through our campus has gone on to create change across society, whether it's by developing life-changing breakthroughs in medicine, fostering connection and understanding through the arts, or countering the injustices of our world head-on. Ours is a community rooted in purpose, guided by our founding Jewish values of openness, a reverence for learning, and a commitment to repairing the world. These are values that our namesake, Justice Brandeis, was also known for. We are fortunate to have his example as our guiding strength.